All right. And meanwhile, Washington had to face problems. In the West, there were Indians. The Indians were concerned because their lands were being taken from them. I mean, okay, well, morally, the Indians were fighting on high ground in that, number one, the land was theirs first. I'm not questioning that. Number two, the white man, hear this from the white man was not keeping his treaties. So the Indians had a moral just, but the other side of it is the fighting was suicide for the Indians. They simply did not have a chance to win. There were too many whites already. You might say, couldn't the whites keep the treaty? Well, in today's world, whether airplanes or helicopters or GPSs or instant communications, yes, a white president can keep whites out of Indian land. But in those days, with the dense forest and the deep woods and the slow communication, George Washington himself said it's impossible. He said it would take more resources than I have to send an army over there to keep the whites out of Indian land. So it wasn't that George Washington did not keep his promise so much as it was the white settlers would move in and Washington didn't have the manpower to move them out. But anyway, the Indians don't understand this, so the Indians rose up and fought. And St. Clair was the original governor of Ohio. St. Clair was defeated in the worst loss the white man ever faced. So up came another man, Anthony Wayne. When St. Clair defeated, George Washington sent Anthony Wayne, who had been a general in the Revolutionary War. Mad Anthony Wayne had a real problem. It's called drinking. That's why he got the name Mad Anthony Wayne. Mad because he spent a lot of his time under the influence of alcohol. Mad Anthony Wayne. Now, Mad Anthony Wayne met the Indians at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. They got the name because a tornado had hit the area one time and knocked down a whole lot of trees. So we got the name Fallen Timbers. Now, on a personal note, when I was 9 years old, my family moved to Waynesboro, which is where Anthony Wayne grew up, and it's named after him. Waynesboro is in southern Pennsylvania near Maryland. And there was a hotel there, the big hotel called Hotel Anthony Wayne. So anyway, Anthony Wayne was one of my childhood heroes. But when he met the Indians at Fallen Timbers, you may know, eating a big meal before a fight slows you down. Football coaches are strict about what their players eat and drink before a big game. They don't want their players to fill up on cake and ice cream before taking a field. Basketball coaches the same way. I mean, they're strict. Players eat and not eat certain types of food. Well, the Indians, they had another law. We don't eat at all before the battle. So Anthony Wayne would pretend he was going to give a battle. The Indians would not eat. Anthony Wayne would not give battle. This went on for 10 days. And after 10 days of this, the Indians were weak and starved. Then Anthony Wayne hit them with a real fight. Defeated the Indians. The Indians surrendered. Now, when the Indians surrendered, Anthony Wayne promised them, and so did the federal government, we'll give you goods and trinkets if you just keep the peace. So the white man gave the Indians axes and hatchets. Well and good, also gave them blankets. Now, folk, there was a serious problem. This is going to sound gross, but the blankets had not been properly laundered, and a lot of the blankets were now known to have been used for people who had smallpox or typhoid fever. And needless to say, the Indians, a lot of them caught smallpox and typhoid fever. This did a lot to destroy, and I don't think our government did it on purpose. It's just sanitation, as we know it today, was not known among these people. Fundamental hygiene was still not practiced. They did not know that germs cause disease. Now, another thing, though, that the white men gave them that really, really, really destroyed the Indians: alcohol. Most persons of Far Eastern descent, Far East of East Asia, do not need to drink alcohol. The other class made me go into detail about the result, but when I was in the Army, there was this Asian man who got drunk one night, and I'm not going to describe his conduct, except to say it would have been hilarious, except it was tragic. The Indians would drink the alcohol, and its effect on them was just simply to destroy them in every way that they could be destroyed and greatly shorten their lives, in addition to stupefying them beyond what it does to other peoples. Anyway, the Indians were given alcohol. Now, one other thing, though, they were given is still in the books, as far as I know. If you are of Indian descent and can prove it, you can get a license to fish for nothing. You know, basically, American Indians are allowed to fish in all of our lakes without getting a license, actually. And they're allowed to hunt without a license. Since I'm not of Indian descent, I won't try. I do have, being over 65, I do have a lifetime fishing license. But I never use it, but I do have one. I told my wife just 2 days ago I planned to do it this summer, but last summer I got busy. Never got around to it. But anyway, the Indians can fish and hunt without a license. That's still on the books, at least as far as I know. Now, in the meantime, across the Atlantic, France and England went to war. Well, back before France and England went to war, the French had a revolution. I remember my first lesson on the French Revolution was when I was in high school. The teacher handed out a paper, "The French Revolution is still an issue." It said, if you ask any American, was the American Revolution justified? Any American's going to say, oh yes, that's obvious. Look how we've come. But if you ask a Frenchman, if you ask 10 Frenchmen what they think about the French Revolution, you might get 11 different opinions. I'm exaggerating slightly. To this day, the French do not know what to make of their own revolution. At first, the Americans thought, oh, we just had a revolution, we're favoring the rebels. And then the revolution took a turn where they favored anarchy. They had a reign of terror. They chopped off the heads of 5,000 people, some of them just for nothing more than not supporting the revolution strong enough. Nobody was safe. The man who invented the guillotine deservedly wound up going to it himself, as a victim, you might say. He deserved it. They chopped off the heads of their king and queen, King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. And they finally realized, what are we doing? They went from one corrupt government to another, and eventually the United States turned against the French Revolution. I mean, at one point they kicked out Christianity. They said the Christian religion is now illegal and all Christians are subject to being killed. They kicked out the church, but then Napoleon came along and he invited the church back in. The French Revolution ended with a dictatorship. It ended with Napoleon taking over. But that's a big part of the story. Now, in the meantime, to the south, in other words, our country was hit from the west by Indians, from the south by a slave revolt. In the land of Haiti, the slaves revolted against their masters. Here's a circumstance. Haiti was part of the French. It was been given to the French. A slave to Saint-L'Ouverture, and if you know how to pronounce that better than I can, you're welcome to. Anyone? Anyway, a slave heard about the revolution in France. They figured rightly, hey, the French can't afford to send an army to us now, let's revolt. And he was right. The French were too divided and split up, and besides that, the French were too busy fighting Austria and fighting Germany and fighting Great Britain and fighting Russia and fighting Spain. Yeah, all those. They couldn't send an army to Haiti. So the revolt happened. Most of the French white people were killed. The slave owners fled over to the Dominican Republic. And Haiti formed a nation of former slaves. Thomas Jefferson became alarmed, and he said, let's not buy any more slaves to the West Indies. These West Indies, see, all right, let me explain. Up until this time, most of the slaves had been brought in from the West Indies because the trip from Africa was long, and a lot of slaves coming from Africa died, but the slaves coming to the West Indies, most of them survived. But Jefferson said, let's not buy any more slaves in the West Indies. So they feared that the revolt would spread. Well, it didn't. But the revolt in Haiti is the only successful revolution that was by black slaves that actually won. A lot of the surviving whites fled not only to the Dominican Republic, which was, if you know anything about Haiti, it shares the same island. The island is called Hispaniola. Haiti and the Dominican Republic are on the same island. Anyway, Haiti formed their own country, but a lot of the white people fled to the United States also, in addition to fleeing to the Dominican Republic next door. Well, in 1792, George Washington was reelected. Don't worry about that, but I do want to emphasize that 1796, George Washington told his electors, "Don't vote for me, I am not running, I'm not going to serve a third term." And he set a precedent today as the law. No president's ever served more than 2 terms except for Franklin Roosevelt. But even he, there became a popular prejudice. And all of our presidents, in turn, after they'd served 2 terms, they'd leave office. Some of them were so unhappy that they knew they had to leave. I mean, they were so unpopular, they knew they had to leave. I want to say this about 2-term presidents. Almost every president who has been re-elected has been brought to grief in his 2nd term. Thomas Jefferson was, with the war in Europe. George Washington faced problems with North Africa as well as war with France and England. Richard Nixon was forced to resign in his 2nd term. William McKinley was shot dead in his 2nd term, as was Abraham Lincoln. Grover Cleveland served 2 non-consecutive terms, but he had economic depression in his 2nd term. Most presidents who've been re-elected have been brought to grief. During their second, Ronald Reagan had a big scandal that almost destroyed him in his 2nd term. So on and so forth. I could go into more detail, but nevertheless, Washington said, "I'm not going to serve a 3rd term," so he retired, and the country elected John Adams. John Adams was only president for 1 term. Now, I want to elaborate. So when Washington left office, he left what's called his farewell address. Now, in 1 sentence, his farewell address says, "Let us stay out of entangling alliances." He also hoped that we not form political parties, which are already forming, but nevertheless they formed anyway. But he said, "Let's be an isolationist country," and for the next 100 years our presidents followed that advice, pretty much. We remained out of foreign affairs largely. Now, with all respect to Washington now, his farewell address has to be outdated because when he made it, we had no jet aircraft, we had no automobiles, we had no radios, no cables going across the Atlantic joining Europe to the United States. There was no television, there was no satellite communication. We have all this today. Nevertheless, he said, let's remain isolationist and let the rest of the world go to rot and go to pot and ruin, but let's keep ourselves out of it. That was his farewell address, and like I say, for the president who finally got us involved in world affairs was President William McKinley, who was president 100 years later. He began to get us involved in foreign affairs, and after that we got involved one after another. All right. John Adams tried to keep himself above politics, but let's face it, the Federalists elected him, and he was not elected unanimously like Washington. Adams had to deal with the problem with France. France had been our friend, but a lot of people said, well, the conditions under which we are friends of France do not apply today. After all, the king has had his head chopped off. The king who helped us had his head chopped off, and we don't like the way that the French Revolution has gone. It seems to be an anarchy and an end of everything good. But anyway, Adams had to deal with it, and we almost went to war with France. We would have gone to war with France except for one thing. just about the time we're about to go to war, John Adams got wind that there's an element in France that wants to make peace. John Adams said, let's call a halt to the war effort. I mean, they got together an army and a navy, and they called George Washington in retirement, ready to go to war. Adams said, let's hold off and let's send a delegation to negotiate one more time. A lot of history books commend Adams for this, but it made Adams unpopular at the time, and he guaranteed he'll be a one-term president. Adams sent a team of ambassadors to France to negotiate a peace treaty. 5 days into the trip, 5 days after they set sail on a several month-long voyage, Napoleon Bonaparte overthrew the corrupt Directory in France. The government that was running France called it Directory. Napoleon overthrew the Directory, and Napoleon, when he received our ambassadors, he was anxious for peace, and he made a peace treaty with the United States and saved us from war. Again, this made Adams highly unpopular. The war was sometimes called the quasi-war because it was Q-U-A-S-I, like fake war, because it was an undeclared war. But we did capture a whole lot of French ships, and in turn the French captured our ships. Now, another thing that made Adams unpopular was the Alien and Sedition Acts. The alien, in this case, the word alien means people who tried to come here in Great Britain. So many of us were of British descent. We said we're not going to take any more Britishers into our country because we're about to go to war with Britain. So all people from Britain were not allowed to come in. Now, sedition meant nobody is allowed to speak against the government. Now, folk, if you think these were unconstitutional, I've got to say this, right in the last couple of years, our present president has tried to exclude people from coming to this country from certain countries. The courts have tried to say it's illegal. Time will tell who's right. But anyway, these issues they faced then, as for sedition, all right, this led to something else. Obviously, telling persons they could not speak against the government is unconstitutional. It's contrary to the First Amendment. The state of Kentucky said, this is an illegal law, it's unconstitutional, so we're not going to obey it. So they put forth the right of nullification. In other words, if we don't like a law that's passed by Congress, we can meet and declare that law null and void in our state. Now, this was the controversy that was to lead to the big Civil War that was to occur later. As a lot of southern states said, and it began with this: if we don't like a law passed by Congress, we don't have to obey it. In other words, South Carolina later was to say, in effect, if you don't play ball my way, I'm going to take my ball and bat and go home. I mean, at first, hey, the Sedition Acts were unconstitutional. But what if they passed a law that wasn't, but the certain states decided not to obey it? This we're going to be talking about in the chapters ahead. Nullification, the right of of states to declare laws null and void. Now today, that's not argued anymore. The Civil War clarified that federal laws have to be obeyed, and if you don't like a law, take it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can declare it null and void. State legislators can't. All right. Anyway, the Alien and Sedition Acts did not last long. They were not very well enforced, but they made Adams extremely unpopular. Now, which takes us up to the election of 1800. For the first time, the election was along party lines. You had the Federalist Party going against the Republican Party, the Federalist Party led by Adams, the Republican Party led by Jefferson. Along party lines, and the two men hated each other. They spoke against each other's personal life, and yes, they brought up the charge that Jefferson had a liaison with a slave girl. A charge was forgotten about for 150 years, but that we now know to be true. Thomas Jefferson really did have a liaison with her name was Sally Heming. But Before we have a break, I want to say this about Jefferson and Adams. I had a pupil tell me outright he didn't believe this story. As both men, well, after both men had retired from public life, they took up residence in private home. Adams went to New England and lived his last days there. Jefferson went to Monticello in Virginia, and somebody told one of them, hey, this other man would like to become friends with you again. So they started writing to each other. We still have a copy of their letters. Jefferson, they became fast, hard, they never saw each other. They became, keep in mind, transfer slow, became fast, hard friends. There's talk about how hard it was now just to walk to the mailbox. They talk about how that men they never heard of are now running the government or in politics. They talk about how they felt left behind, and they speculate on which one of us is going to die first and what can we have waiting for us in the afterlife. They discuss this in their letters. One day, John Adams knew he was dying that day, and his last words were, Thomas Jefferson still lives. No, he didn't know. That very morning, Thomas Jefferson had died. But in those days, this was a few years before the telegraph was invented. You don't believe this. Yes, they both died on the same day. The day they died was on July the 4th, exactly 50 years to the day after Thomas Jefferson had written the Declaration of Independence, 1826. It actually happened, folk. Check it out for yourself. I see one person's head nodding. You probably may have heard this before. This actually happened. They both died on the same day. Again, Thomas Jefferson died first in the morning.
Jefferson and Adams?
And Adams died in the late in the evening. And I said, Adams did not know that Jefferson already died. I mean, Jefferson's estate sent a letter to the Adams family, not knowing that Adams was about to die himself. And Adams' last word to him, Thomas Jefferson still lives. No, he didn't. All right, anyway, the two men later on made up, became fast friends. All right, folk, be back in about 10 minutes.